That's one of the weirder questions I've been asked. I have no idea. How was the race atmosphere with a fully packed crowd at Silverstone? Well, the answer to this is simple. It was utterly brilliant. It's always good to have a fully packed Grand Prix weekend, and Silverstone is always one of the favourites in that regard because the people that come are so enthusiastic. But to do so after so many races where we've had such meagre attendance in the grandstands, or none at all because of COVID, made it a particular thrill. Absolutely great to look out as we came out of the garage and looked out across the grandstands at all those faces. Just reminded you of what a pleasure and what a privilege it is to be involved in this sport. And I hope it's a signal of many, many happy races like that to come. How much does the sprint weekend make our race preparation and setup more challenging? It doesn't change things in the way you might expect. It's all different, but it doesn't make it too much more complicated. So it's not like suddenly everything is more difficult, but because everything is different, it tended to make us feel all the way through the weekend that we were missing something because the rhythm of the weekend was not the same. We're so used to FP1, FP2 on a Friday, then a certain work program on the car, then FP3 in the morning, qualifying, and then race on Sunday. That's ingrained in the race team in a way that's sort of down deep in their bones. And so coming into a race weekend where instead the sessions are all at different times, the work list in between the sessions, a different work list, not a more difficult work list, just a different work list. It meant everyone felt just off balance all weekend. It made everyone think, crikey, should I be somewhere else? Is there a meeting I'm supposed to be at that I've forgotten? Have I broken curfew? Am I just not where I'm supposed to be? There was a feeling of just being out of kilter all weekend. Of course, all that will fade and become normal if we do more of these sprint races in the future, because we'll get the knack of it and we'll start to feel like that's normal, or we'll be able to maintain two normals at once because it's sufficiently familiar. But it was an odd experience this weekend, just not necessarily a difficult experience. Why did Lewis and Valtteri have poor starts across the weekend, and what can be done to improve this? Well, I wouldn't take the premise of that question exactly as it's meant, because we didn't have poor starts across the weekend as in every start was poor. In fact, if you looked at Lewis's start in the main event at the start of the Grand Prix, that was a pretty useful start. But it was definitely not one of our better weekends for starts, and we were certainly far more hit and miss than we would like to be. If you look at our performance in starts as a whole, we're normally one of the better teams, and so this weekend was a little disappointing. Starts are complicated, and getting everything right so that that start works exactly as it should do, metronomically every single time with the best and most high performance start possible, is a very difficult thing to achieve. It's what we strive to achieve, of course, but sometimes we don't get it right in every aspect. I think perhaps one of the ways that it's easiest to explain the general problem is just to talk specifically through the worst start we did this weekend, which was Lewis's start in the sprint qualifying race on the Saturday. So he'd done all that good work on the Friday, got himself up at the front of the grid, only to see that evaporate with a very lackluster start on the Saturday. How did that happen? Well, in general, when you do a start, you are trying to arrive at your grid slot with your tyres at a temperature that is a little bit higher than you want when the lights go out, because you know that you're going to sit there for several seconds while the rest of the grid forms behind you. And while you're sitting there, your tyres are getting cooler and cooler and cooler. And if you've got it just right, then as you go down the grid, preparing to arrive at your grid slot, you're doing a number of burnouts that lift the temperature of the tyres up above the tyre target temperature that you want at the start. Then you stop in your grid slot, the tyres start to cool, and if everything is perfect, then they will have cooled and arrived at your perfect target temperature just at the moment that the lights go out. Now, in our case on the Saturday, Lewis did lots of burnouts, got the tyre temperature up high, In fact, he got it higher than we had recommended in the burnouts, and was then sitting on the grid with the tyres cooling as we waited for the grid to form behind us. Good job that he got it higher than we'd recommended, because actually by the time everyone was ready behind him, his tyres had cooled sufficiently that they were actually a little bit lower than the target temperature we'd aimed for, a bit below where we wanted. So when then Lewis let the clutch out at the start, hitting, by the way, in the process exactly the target that he'd been set, instead of the wheels biting into the road and gripping it perfectly, because the tyres were just a little bit too cold, the tyres, instead of gripping the road perfectly, they started to spin slightly. That always gives the driver an unnerving feeling, because if the tyres keep spinning, the car simply will not accelerate. When the driver lets go of the clutch, he lets go to this specific target. The car is supposed to just leap off into the distance, but the clutch is not fully let go at that point. The driver is still holding the clutch at the target. So Lewis did that, hit his target, the wheels lit up, and Lewis then, because the wheels were spinning, wanted to hold the clutch in that slipping position just a bit longer than normal, because he felt that the engine, if he gave it all of the power of the engine, it would really just continue to make those wheels spin. And so he hung onto the clutch for just about, a heartbeat or two longer than he should have done in response to that original wheel slip. And by hanging onto that clutch just a heartbeat or two too long, he under-delivered power from the engine, and as a result, people came streaming around him. It's a tiny, tiny error caused by the mistake that we made in estimating the correct temperatures at the start, which then caused that small initial wheel slip. So it's a very, very complex process to get the start dead right, and it's easy to just make small mistakes that cause the sort of effects you saw. How can we make it better in the future? Well, each of the many, many steps that have to be just right, I guess we have to engineer them so that they're more robust, so that you can be a little bit wrong or a little bit right, and it doesn't make a big amount of difference. You're not standing right at the edge of a cliff that if you get just slightly wrong, you topple over and plummet to your doom. You just would try to make every part of that process of the start a little bit more tolerant to error, so that when all the unusual things that can happen at a start happen, it doesn't have such a punishing effect. That's what we try to do. It's what we've been trying to do for years, and we do make improvements with it, but it's not perfect, never will be, and we just try to make it a little bit better with the passage of time, and we'll keep trying to do that. Did the upgrades that we brought to the race have the desired effect, and is there anything more to come? I'll say yes. That's the simple and short answer. We brought a decent aero package to the track. We definitely saw an improvement in our performance, and we were very happy with it. Whether the performance was a little bit more or a little bit less than we imagined is really hard to tell, because you don't get the luxury of performing a controlled experiment. You don't run the old package and the new package several times doing back-to-back tests with fresh tyres each time, because the weekend just doesn't give you that luxury. Nevertheless, you do and are able to make some comparison, because you make measurements on the car with all the sensors, and you can compare back to the weekends before and look at the performance of the car before and compare to the one that you had this weekend. And it did all seem to be behaving very well. And if you then look at the stopwatch, you could see that just relative to the field, we had moved forward this weekend. We were able to close some ground on Red Bull, and were able to have a more competitive weekend as a result. So we came home from the weekend pretty chipper about the upgrade. Is there any more to come? There may be here and there, but the vast sort of, the main industrial effort of our development program, that was the last big package that we'll bring this year. But there'll be a few tweaks here and there where we can see efficiently that we could bring some performance without distracting us from the big effort that's now going into next year's car. Why did we decide to put Valtteri on the softs for the sprint qualifying? During the course of the free practice, we try to look at all the compounds that we're given by the tyre manufacturer for that weekend. We try to weigh up how each one will perform, both on a single lap and also on a longer run. So by the time we had to make the decision about sprint qualifying, we already had a pretty good idea of how the medium would perform and also the soft. And we could see that although the soft would be worse over the duration of the stint, over the 17 laps of the sprint qualifying, we could also see that it was a pretty reasonable tyre. It wasn't going to fall to pieces, it wasn't going to cause a disaster on pace. And in fact, it was reasonably competitive with the medium tyre. However, it does have one thing that is very strongly in its favour, and that is at the start it gets you just 1 or 2 metres more of performance compared with the medium. So we had Lewis up in front, then Verstappen in the second position on the grid, and Valtteri behind. And by putting Valtteri on the softer tyre, we had a good chance of being able to jump past Verstappen at the start. Now, as it happens, that isn't how it worked out, but that was the intention, and had it happened, then the performance that was in that soft tyre would have been plenty to defend the position for the remainder of the sprint qualifying, which would have clearly been to our team's advantage and to Valtteri's advantage. So that was why we did it, and we're just disappointed that the way the starts fell didn't cause that advantage to bring us anything in the end. What damage did Lewis have on his car after the contact with Verstappen at the start? We were lucky, the damage was pretty minor. We had a broken or nearly broken front left rim and also some relatively cosmetic damage to the front wing end plate, where a little sensor that we have that looks back at the tyres to measure their temperature had been broken off at its stalk and was just hanging by the sensor wire instead of the nice mounting that we make for it. Why did the team use glue and tape to fix the front wing instead of replacing the whole front wing element? Just because that was the easiest thing for us to do. The wing aerodynamically was completely unaffected by the incident. All the bits that generate the downforce, look after the performance of the car, they were just pucker. And we knew very, very clearly what the balance of the car was with that wing on that day. And we didn't need to disturb the car in any way by putting a new front wing on, because the small manufacturing differences between the front wings might have given us a slightly different balance. It was far more expedient just to fix the tiny bit of damage that we had incurred, which was the breaking free of the front tyre temperature sensor from its mountings, just to quickly fix that with a bit of tape and glue rather than have to change the whole element. It was just the easiest thing for us to do at the time, and the best way of ensuring that we would have identical performance after the change, after the restart, from what we had before. How was the crash perceived from our end, and did we feel the stewards were harsh with their penalty? There was quite a lot of discussion live on camera while we waited to restart the race about who was right and who was wrong, and that discussion rages on today. We were concerned after the incident and prior to the restart to make sure that the stewards had read and were following the FIA's internal guidance to stewards on the rights and wrongs of overtaking. Because as far as we're concerned, the manoeuvre that took place, the manoeuvre that Lewis did, was absolutely in line with the FIA's overtaking guide. If you are on the inside of a corner, overtaking on the inside of the corner, then the guidance requires that you are substantially alongside. It does not require that you are ahead. It requires that you are substantially alongside as you arrive at the corner. Lewis definitely was substantially alongside. He had his front axle well beyond the midpoint of Verstappen's car. It requires you are substantially alongside, and it requires that you must be able to make the corner. By make the corner, it means go round the corner and not leave the track or lose control of the car. Those are the things you need to satisfy. If you can go round the corner, if you are substantially alongside the other car, then the corner is yours. What that means is not that you have to emerge in the lead. What it means is you do not have to cede your position. You do not have to back off. And the other car has a duty to avoid hitting you. So if you follow the notes that are provided to the FIA stewards and you look frame by frame at what happened with Lewis, he was substantially alongside. He absolutely would have made the corner, indeed did make the corner, and therefore there was no need for him to cede any ground. So I did feel that it was harsh to get the penalty. I realise not everyone agrees with that, but I still believe that to be the case. And I certainly think that whether Copse is a fast corner or a slow corner makes no difference. This is about what are the rules to do with overtaking. And I didn't see that Lewis did anything wrong in those, with respect to those rules. And indeed, later in the race, Lewis made 2 further overtakes at Copse, using exactly the same guidance, and there wasn't a contact in either of those cases. So yeah, I personally feel it was a harsh decision. In the end, for our outcome, it didn't make any difference, but I can understand people who maybe don't understand that there's no obligation on you to hit the apex of the corner, that you don't have to have your whole car in front of the other car. I can understand that if you're seeing it from that perspective, you might think that the car coming from behind has some sort of obligation to make sure that no crashes take place. But if you look at the stewarding document, then I think that Lewis did nothing wrong. In retrospect, should Valtteri have been left out longer on the medium tyre? I don't think so. Valtteri was behind Norris at the time prior to the stops as a result of a rather average start. And it was difficult to get past anyone on this track by overtaking. The tyres were hot, it was a hot day, the overtaking tyres tend to neutralise car performance, so even if you're quite a bit quicker than the car in front of you, it's very hard to overtake at Silverstone on a hot day. So it was very difficult to overtake on the track, and we saw Norris come in the stop and have a very lousy stop. He had several seconds of delay in the garage, and that was our opportunity to put Valtteri in front of Norris, get that problem behind us and work in free air from there and see what fortune brought us from that point. Wasn't the optimal time to stop from a tyre usage point of view, but definitely the right call for Valtteri's race as it got him free of Norris. Of course, it did mean, therefore, that he had a compromised strategy relative to Lewis, who was able to stay out a little longer and who was therefore quicker in the second stint on fresher tyres. And it's a tribute to Valtteri's fairness and decency as a teammate that he allowed Lewis to take advantage of that youngness of his tyres by ceding the place to him later in the race and setting up what was eventually a memorable win for our team. So no, I don't think we did the wrong thing for Valtteri. It was definitely what allowed him to rid himself of Norris and get himself up on the podium. Did Lewis save his tyres for a late charge? Not so much. We stopped Lewis at pretty much the optimum time for that single stop strategy that we did in Silverstone. Used up the mediums. We weren't especially pleased with our pace on the mediums. The car had overheated a little on them, if we're honest. Once he got onto the hard tyre, the car was a very different animal. The overheating had gone and Lewis was able to push pretty hard. You saw right at the beginning of that stint him dispatching, I think it was Norris, with a reasonable amount of ease and certainly not holding back tyres for a late charge. The tyre was robust and Lewis was able just to lean on it harder and harder and harder as the fuel load came out of the car. And as those laps unfolded, the Ferrari in front was struggling a little bit with a couple of things. Firstly, I think the Ferrari wasn't quite so happy on the hard tyre as it had been on the medium, but also they got in a little bit of fuel trouble. They'd been using the fuel harder in the first part of the race and they got a bit of a debt to pay off in the second half of the race, and that sort of exaggerated the closing up on Leclerc in part of Lewis's stint. I think by the time that Lewis finally caught up with Charles, I think that at that point the fuel problem had more or less been handled by the Ferrari, but by then the Ferrari's tyre wear was hurting it and Lewis's tyres were still in really good shape, and we were able to get past with a couple of laps to go, and very, very happy for it. What is my spirit animal? That's one of the weirder questions I've been asked. I have no idea. My wife used to tell me I was spiritually dead, So I'm not sure that I know the answer to the question of what my spirit animal is. Skunk, blobfish, something deeply uncool. I don't know. You need to suggest to me what my spirit animal is, because I've not really ever given it a moment's thought. What was it like meeting Tom Cruise? If I'm honest, most of the time I was thinking my son's going to be really pissed off with me because he'd love to meet Tom Cruise. And here I am just weirdly showing him around the garage and talking to him about Formula One cars. What was he like? He was a charming guest. He was really interested in what we're doing. He wanted to keep a pretty low profile, so he was just listening and talking to us all, and was really fascinated to be taken around the garage and see the amount of love and care that we put into our car. And I think if there was any commonality between our world and his, is that the same sort of people that work in movies, they're obsessive about what they do and they love what they do. And I think he could pick up a little of that in what he saw in our garage. And as a result of that, there was a bit of fellow feeling about the fun of our respective jobs. And so it made him a pleasurable guest to show around. Thank you all very much for your questions. We'll be back in a couple of weeks after the Hungarian Grand Prix.